keeping the British people safe, and strengthening our leadership in NATO even further.
Well, let's speak now to Stefanie Babst, who was NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General from 2006 to 2012 and NATO's Strategic Foresight Team from 2012 to 2020. Good to have you with us here on BBC News. Let's talk first about President Trump, of course, because all eyes were him. This was a summit that was built around him. He not only committed to this 5% this 5% target for all of the NATO countries, said it was his triumph, but he also reaffirmed the US commitment to Article 5, Stefanie, and spoke so warmly about the other NATO allies. Is there generally going to be a sense of relief at how well this summit has gone and that he is now totally on board, it seems?
Well, I'm not sure how others feel about the summit. I can only share with you how I feel about it. And just listening to the very lofty and submissive words of the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte in the presence of President Trump, I was wondering, whether the strategic political level of ambition of NATO allies is really that low. There was no talk, no discussion about Russia. There was no answer to the question how we collectively could actually push back and contain successfully Russia. There was no talk about Ukraine and how we can, as NATO, live up to the commitment of bringing Ukraine into NATO. So the larger, really vitally, strategically important questions were all brushed aside because it was reduced to the prime question of how to make President Trump, well, comfortable and in a way happy. And I think this overall is a very, very low level of ambition that the allies have demonstrated here.
Is not the benefit, though, of keeping President Trump on board the fact that they are the most powerful and biggest member of NATO, that the alliance is not the same, it doesn't offer the same kind of deterrent if the US is not part of it? And because he's threatened to leave in the past, it was essential to make sure that he remained committed to the alliance.
It would be absolutely wonderful, and I'm saying this as a dedicated transatlantic believer that I've been all my life, to have the United States next to us, on our side. But I'm afraid to say that President Trump, in his rhetoric, but also in his actions, have really cast doubt to his commitment to the rules-based order as such, to international organizations. He is completely agnostic about the fate of Ukraine. He has shown that he is more than sympathetic to the Russian aggressor. And he has sided even with Iran, North Korea, and other countries in UN veto, vetoes. So in other words, I'm not too convinced of his commitment of staying with us as a credible and reliable ally. Others may feel differently, but I think he has already pulled at least out with one leg from the European security issue.
Stefanie, what about this big headline, though, about the 5%? What will those billions of extra dollars that NATO will now have enable the alliance to do? Because it's a lot more money coming into the coffers.
Evident, because we are talking about the need for Europeans to upgrade their military capabilities, their manpower, and their defense-related technologies for what? For more than 11 years. I attended the NATO summit in Wales that took place in 2014, and I heard the allies making a pledge to spend 2% of their GDP on defense and to really, really bolster their defense against Russia, who had just grabbed illegally Crimea. Now, 11 years have passed. I'm not saying nothing has happened, but my confidence in seeing all allies collectively really, really moving forward is, let's say, limited.
Well, they have all signed up to the declaration, but you're right, we'll have to see if they do deliver on those pledges. I wonder then, you mentioned that we didn't see an acknowledgement of the Russian threat in that declaration, and also that Ukraine only got that one small mention and quite further down. President Zelensky was here. Is there anything, I mean, he had that meeting with President Trump as well, is there anything then, Stefanie, that this summit has actually delivered for Ukraine?
Well, it was obvious that the NATO allies tried to work around having President Zelensky sitting as an equal, as a peer at the table of the North Atlantic Council. He was offered a seat at the gala dinner and a few bilaterals with EU officials. I'm not saying that's bad. So clearly he was able to make his pleas and reiterate his calls for more military aid and to harder and tougher sanctions against Russia. But at the end of the day, I think the Ukrainian leadership in Kiev has come to acknowledge that they must actually fight on their own terms. And what we've seen in recent weeks, sometimes quite spectacular in terms of their military operation, leads me to think, yes, they have become the strategic center of gravity in Europe, and they should no longer just stand in front of NATO's door begging others to come in. I think it should be the other way around. We should look to actually par with Ukraine, because they really have the strongest military army in Europe and really a first-class military warfighting experience. So this is a long shot, what I'm saying now, but I hope that the Ukrainians will continue to show the political stamina and the resolve to really fight back against the Russian aggression that some of us unfortunately lack.
Stefanie, the criticism that you have of the results from today is interesting, because we've heard so much gushing and so many flattering words about how consequential the summit has been, how historic the summit has been. Do you think then that it is really time for the alliance to look at a different kind of leadership structure, one that isn't so reliant on the US? And if that were to happen, how then do these EU countries that have to placate their own domestic audiences do that?
Well, I belong to those advocates who think that we should not, as Europeans, forbid ourselves to think about the future of our own security and our own continent by just clinging on, to a US military presence. As I already said, I wish it would be different, but I think we would need to really start preparing some contingency planning, also for the case when the US might decide to cut their forces in Europe, or cut their financial contributions to NATO's various budgets, or simply loses interest in Ukraine. So you can't do this actually in NATO, but looking, for instance, at the coalition of the willing, very much led by the United Kingdom and France, I personally think that we will see more of these group buildings, either inside or outside NATO, with NATO nations, NATO member states, simply get together in smaller groups in order to move ahead with military cooperation, but also with an exchange on the broader strategic issues, which are so urgently waiting for responses.
Stefanie, really great to get your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting to talk to you.